time.
General Westmoreland, in March of 1964, Secretary McNamara was in Saigon, South Vietnam, barnstorming around with General Kahn. What did you think of that?
The thing that we needed most in Vietnam at that time was political stability. Kahn had taken over by virtually a bloodless coup from the junta that followed the overthrow of President Diem. And the administration in Washington, and Mr. McNamara was there to represent Mr. Johnson, and his administration was doing everything he could to build up the prestige of General Kahn and make it known to General Kahn and to the people of South Vietnam that America was behind Vietnam, and in particular behind General Kahn, who had taken over as president.
What effect do you think that had on the stability of the Kahn government?
Well, I don't think it was necessarily a wasted effort. I think for a short period of time it had an impact, particularly among Kahn's colleagues, his fellow officers. It indicated to them that America was going to support General Kahn and was not going to support any other faction to displace him. So I think in the short range it had a positive effect.
Your predecessor, General Harkins, was generally regarded as being overly optimistic. What did he say in his leave-taking dinner at the Caravel?
General Harkins, Paul Harkins, of course, had served under General Patton during World War II. He was his deputy chief of staff. At the farewell dinner that was held for him at the Caravel Hotel, he did say that he was a very optimistic person, and he had been optimistic while he was in command, and he continued to be optimistic. My contacts with General Harkins bore that out. His contacts with Mr. McNamara were excessively, in my opinion, optimistic. But certainly General Harkins was a very honorable man, an experienced soldier, and he passed his judgments in good faith.
You wrote that during the McNamara visit to Saigon and Honolulu in June of '64, thinking in Washington on increasing troop commitments was more advanced than anything you were considering in Saigon. What were they thinking at that time, and how did you feel about it? It was June '64.
They were grasping for straws. They realized that a commitment had been made to the South Vietnamese people. There was political instability, which was rampant. It was realized that we had to build up the South Vietnamese forces, and programs were projected in order to increase their military strength. On the other hand, intelligence indicated that the enemy was getting more active, and North Vietnamese troops were beginning to move down through Laos. There was a feeling at the time that bombing might be able to do the trick and pass a message to the leaders in Hanoi that America had great military power and that they should be careful or that power would be used against them. But this message was a small magnitude with respect to bombing, and the message, of course, was never transmitted during that time frame, and matter of fact, to a very small degree thereafter, because the bombing was on and off.
But at that time, were you thinking or recommending bombing? You were trying to get a government together in a sort of revolving door government and so on.
When the bombing program started, and that was the strategy that the Johnson administration wanted to pursue, I realized that the airfields, and we had 3 jet-capable airfields, were extremely vulnerable. If that strategy was to be a viable one, we had to protect those airfields. I feared that the Vietnamese did not have the capability of protecting the American aircraft on those airfields, and therefore my first requests for troops were associated with the essentiality of protecting the airfields.
Well, let's get into troops a little later. I have a couple of specific questions, and then I want to get into the bombing in some detail. You wrote that nobody would have faulted us if we had made a graceful exit in early '65 during some of the political chaos. Did you feel that way at the time?
No, that's basically a retrospective judgment. Those of us in Vietnam were people that had a mission given by our government, and we were doing our utmost to carry it out, and we had expectations that we could carry it out.
Tell us what your retrospective judgment was.
Politically, Saigon was in a state of disarray, characterized by political chaos. It was like trying to push a piece of spaghetti. We were not quite sure who was running the country, and the province chiefs in the various provinces were not sure themselves. Therefore, they were reluctant to make decisions. So the government was pretty much at a standstill, and actions throughout the countryside were pretty well at a standstill by virtue of a very cautious approach by the Vietnamese in the provinces. In retrospect, of course, because of this political chaos, which prevailed for, approximately 2 years, I think it could have been justified that we renege on our commitment and withdraw, and it would have been far better to have done it at that time than to do it when we did, after the commitment of considerable resources and the loss of many lives. But to the best of my knowledge, that was not considered by the administration, although it may have been in Washington. I am aware of no messages from Washington to Saigon to the ambassador asking for our advice in that regard. However, the ambassador at that time would know better than I in that connection.
At the end of '64, early '65, there was what I gather was a particularly important battle at Bin Cha. What was the significance of that?
That occurred in late '63. It occurred in the Delta region, the 4th Corps area.
That was late '64. December 28, '64.
Oh, in Bin Cha, I'm sorry. Yes. At Bin Cha, yes. That was an action by main forces of the basically North Vietnamese. There were some local forces involved, but it was basically a North Vietnamese battalion that attacked a hamlet and overran it, and some of the reinforcements were ambushed, and the battalion was virtually destroyed. But during that time frame, there were a number of battalions destroyed, being destroyed at about one a week. It appeared that the communists were moving into phase 3 of Mao Zedong's doctrine for insurgency warfare, the third phase being to move into conventional warfare. Now, I didn't feel that there was going to be an abrupt move in that direction. This was the use of battalion-sized units, reinforced battalion-sized units by the enemy, and the successful use that I feared would spread, and was perhaps the beginning of a gradual movement toward a major effort, using not guerrillas, not small units, but large units.
Let's talk about the beginning of the bombing for a minute. There were calls for reprisal bombing after the Bien Hoa attack on November 1st, '64. Did you recommend reprisal bombing then?
I referred to it as tit for tat. If they carried out a major piece of sabotage by bombing a hotel or mortaring an airbase, that we would immediately respond by hitting a target that would be harmful to them. But it had to be done immediately in order to have the enemy relate their actions in the south to our reprisal in the north. But it would be done in a very discriminating way.
But at
I was for that program. I was not for any general bombing at that time, for the simple reason that I did not want to provoke a reaction, and the only reaction that they were capable of taking was to move more troops to the south, and we were not prepared to handle more enemy troops at that time.
the Benoit attack, what was your reaction? I just want to repeat it because my question interrupted you.
The Benoit attack? Yes, I thought there should be a reprisal. In other words, that would be immediate and as a reaction to.
Camera roll 6:15 starts here.
Did you recommend reprisal bombing after the Benoit attack on November 1st?
Yes, I did, based on the tit-for-tat concept. They commit an action against us, and we retaliate with an action immediately that will be related by the enemy to their initiative in the south.
What about after the Brinks hotel bombing in Christmas of '64?
I was in favor of hitting a selected target following that, yes.
But curiously, at this time, LBJ rejected it and said he was interested in troops, wasn't he? Didn't he wire you and say?
Well, the tit-for-tat program didn't work because there was so much discussion as to the target, where Washington got involved in a lot of detail. That time went by, and the relationship between the enemy's action in the south and our retaliatory action was lost. So the entire effect of the tit-for-tat bombing fell by the wayside.
But it hadn't really begun yet.
But during that time frame, Mr. Johnson did make it known that he didn't think that bombing would do the job, and he felt that ground action in the south or some reinforcement on the ground in the south would be a more prudent and more effective policy. And his initiative in that regard was the first associated with his subsequent commitment of American ground forces.
But as I remember, after the Brinks bombing, you asked for reprisal bombing, and he said he'd entertain requests for troops. Was that a surprise?
Yes, it was. It was a surprise. However, it was not something that I hadn't considered, and we had been thinking in terms of troops, where we would put them, and the number that we would be able to support logistically. I had asked for a logistic organization and for an engineer brigade so that we would be prepared to logistically support troops if and when they were required and authorized. So, yes, his initiative came as a surprise, but I don't want to give you the impression that we had not considered that. We considered all options.
Now, after Pleiku, did you recommend a reprisal tit-for-tat bombing?
After Pleiku, yes. I was very much in favor of a reprisal effort. I felt it should be rather discriminating, though. I did not think it should be the beginning of a more general bombing campaign. I was not enthusiastic about trying to accomplish our mission in the South through the use of bombing. And I felt there was considerable danger in bombing the North to the point where the North Vietnamese authorities felt that they would have to retaliate. And the only way they could retaliate was to move massive ground troops down to the south. And I was in no position to accommodate that type of action by them. Later on, when I had enough troops to take care of ourselves and protect our installations and defeat any massive movement of troops to the south, I was very much in favor of a substantial bombing program.
But when Rolling Thunder began in March of 1965, it was really sort of an arm twisting, a graduated response. Did you think that would work?
I did not. I did not, and I was very lukewarm about it. I became very strongly in support in early 1966, at which time I had the beginnings of a logistical structure. I had enough troops to take care of any retaliatory action on the ground by the Hanoi regime. But initially, before early 1967, I was not enthusiastic about the bombing program. Now, the bombing program to the north was not under me. It was under the Commander-in-Chief Pacific. Now, there is a school of thought that massive bombing at that time may have dissuaded the Hanoi regime to change their strategy. That would have required a rather substantial bombing effort to give it any prospect of success. I saw no disposition by the Johnson administration at that time to engage in any extensive and massive bombing campaign. But
We should clip. Speed. Market.
General Westmoreland, the bombing strategy was a graduated response, sort of an arm twisting. How did you feel about it?
something had to be done to bolster the South Vietnamese government and give them more confidence. It was felt in Washington that a gradual bombing campaign that could be increased over a period of time and expanded would serve that purpose. My interest, however, was more than bringing about a stable and a strong regime in the South, which was at that time very fragile. And my feeling was that we should get well established in the South, build up the Vietnamese army, give the people confidence in defeating the enemy troops on their soil before we proceeded to take the war to the North. So I was lukewarm about the so-called Rolling Thunder campaign during 1965. But at the beginning of 1936, with General Chu and Air Marshal Key having taken over the leadership of the country.
You said 1936. You mean 1966?
1966. 1966. I felt that we were in a sufficiently stable position in the South. We were not dealing with a fragile government. That the bombing campaign was important. And at that time, I was in full support of the bombing campaign, but I wanted to use a shock action as opposed to creeping escalation, if you will.
You would have been in favor of more massive action like the kind Nixon took later on?
After 1966, but not before.
But you have to, I don't want to use my question, you have to say what you were in favor of. What kind of bombing action were you in favor of after 1966?
To hit those targets associated with their military effort. That include military targets, bases, marshalling areas, petroleum farms, port facilities, and anything associated with their ability to wage war.
What kind of control did you have over bombing targets?
I had no control over the targets in North Vietnam except in the extended battle area, that area just north of the demilitarized zone, and in Laos. Bombing campaign to the north was under the command of the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, who carried it out through his Navy and air components. They both had aircraft, the Navy aboard carriers, and the Air Force based in Vietnam and subsequently in Thailand, and with B-52s later from Guam. Those targets were selected by Admiral Sharp, but had to be approved by Washington. I was not associated with that, but I was aware of the targets, and I was in a position to recommend targets.
But
if
did
I
you
thought
feel
they
as
were
if your
important.
hands were tied a little bit? I mean, it's a long, circuitous route, and you're the commander on the scene.
Well, I was commander of the ground forces in Vietnam, but I was not commander of the air forces. See, the unified command was in Honolulu, and headed by Admiral Sharp. The chain of command and the general military organization during the Vietnam is another subject. In my opinion, it was not a strong organizational arrangement in order to prosecute a war.
We'll get to that later. When the troops came in to defend Da Nang, were you the one who first asked for the troops to come into Da Nang Air Base?
I did. I wanted to protect the Da Nang Air Base, which was essential to the prosecution of the air war.
Were you there to greet them?
I was not, no.
Tell us about that.
Well, the troops moved in from the sea, and the chain of command was from the Commander-in-Chief Pacific to his Navy Component Commander to the 7th Fleet and down to the Amphibious Force. And under the military and naval doctrine, those troops are under command of the admiral at sea until they are established ashore. Therefore, I was not associated with the details of their moving ashore. I wasn't aware that they were going to necessarily move ashore in battle formation. It was not essential that they do so. The exercise was to get them ashore and get them deployed around the air base in order to secure that air base in view of the fact that our plans were based on air action, and the Da Nang Air Base was a very important one.
Didn't it...
We got 10 feet.
Did you think they were... What do you feel about the manner of their arriving?
Well, it didn't bother me. It didn't bother me. I think it bothered perhaps some members of the embassy, but it didn't bother me. If I wanted to make a training exercise out of a landing on a beach, and it was an excellent beach, they got a plus from a military standpoint of the training as well as moving them ashore. But
General, when the Marines first landed, what did it remind you of? There was a World War II reference that you used in your book, and I wanted you to tell us about it. They stormed ashore as if they were taking Iwo Jima. Do you feel comfortable giving that?
Well, of course, the Marines and the Army troops made innumerable amphibious landings during the course of World War II, particularly in the South Pacific, and this was a reenactment of an assault on the beach, and it played a training role in that regard. I mean, normally that's the way Marines come ashore. It wasn't necessary, for my purposes, that they come ashore in battle formation. They could have been landed at a dock. But the training value was of significance to the Marines, and so they did make a practice assault landing.
Did you see the Marines landing at Da Nang, or the Marines coming in to defend the airbase as the beginning of a troop buildup, or at the time was it sort of the tag end of the bombing, the logical consequence of the bombing decisions?
It was associated with the bombing decisions because of the importance of the Da Nang airfield. Of course, needless to say, I hoped that that measure, that next step, would suffice, but I was realistic. I didn't think that it would. And I certainly did not rule out additional troops, and we were preparing plans to stop there or to bring in additional troops if we deemed it necessary to carry out the mission of our government. And Mr. McNamara advised me on that occasion and on innumerable occasions during his visits to Saigon that I should ask for whatever troops or whatever military forces that I thought were needed in order to carry out our national objective.
What were the factors that made you ask for additional troops? What happened after the Marines came that made you say, I want more troops?
Primarily our intelligence that the North Vietnamese were moving more and more troops down through Laos, and they were building up their military forces in the south at a rapid pace, far more rapid than we could build up the South Vietnamese forces. And in order to assure that there would be no setback, if the South Vietnamese could not cope with it and we could not build them up at the pace that the enemy troops were being built up, the only answer was to supplement the Vietnamese with more American troops.
Did were there some key battles in the spring of '65 that really made it necessary to bring in more Americans? I mean,
Yes, there were a number of setbacks involving major or conventional type formations, battalions, and even regimental formations by the enemy. And during that time frame, there were South Vietnamese battalions being lost and depleted at a more rapid rate than Vietnamese forces could be recruited and constituted into fighting units to replace them. So in effect we were losing ground, and the only answer was to supplement the South Vietnamese with American forces.
what was your fear at that time? We worried about the North Vietnamese were coming in, your intelligence said, but what did you think their objective was? What were you trying to prevent?
Well, the objective of Hanoi from the very beginning was to take over the South and unify Vietnam, which of course they subsequently did after we had pulled out. Their plans were very clear. Their objective was very clear, that they were going to take over the South through subversion and invasion.
Were you worried that they were going to cut South Vietnam in half?
Yes, getting into what I perceived as their tactical plans during the '65 period, evidence and intelligence suggested that they wanted to cut Vietnam in half between Pleiku and Kon Tum and the coast. And that meant that we had to give consideration to the Highlands area, because the Highlands are adjacent to the route down through Laos and then into Cambodia. And that was a matter of concern, and that required troops with some mobility. Now, the American troops had that mobility. The Vietnamese troops, except for the airborne troops, which consisted of only one brigade, and subsequently expanded to a division, but in the later years extended to a division. They had mobility, but other than that, the Vietnamese did not have that mobility to fight far away from their bases, and their logistic organization was very marginal to do that. This encouraged me to develop a logistic base that would allow us to fight anywhere in Vietnam as required, and as a reaction to the enemy initiatives. It also motivated me to ask for American troops that had that capability.
Did you, I want to get you to say that you felt at some point we had to put our finger in the dike. That's...
Yes.
You got to say it.
Well, during that time, things were becoming unraveled, and I did use the expression at that time, we've got to put our finger in the dike, and that meant that we had to supplement the Vietnamese, who were losing ground, with American forces.
What was the significance of the Battle of Dong Xoai, or Bin Cha?
Well, I was just north of Saigon, getting rather close to Saigon, in a highly populated area. It was an outpost, however. I mean, the immediate area was not highly populated, but it was adjacent to a highly populated area. And there was a Ranger battalion there, and quite an intensive fight, which was won by the Vietnamese Rangers, but because of our advisors and special forces. So that was another example of a gradual movement to phase 3, the use of the enemy of regular formations, regular tactical formations, battalions and higher units, as opposed to being just a guerrilla war.
But, I mean, faced with all that, you have regular battalions, it's no longer a guerrilla war. you're the commander in the field. How did you feel? What did you ask for? What did you think you needed in order to stem the tide?
Well, I wanted to have the capability of moving American troops into the Highlands. I wanted to protect Vung Tau and the air base at Benoit. These air bases were important to us, and my initial request for troops, following the Marines that came into Da Nang, was an airborne brigade to move into the Benoit and to the Vung Tau area, to give us a stronger posture and to have a military force that was capable of reacting to further initiatives. My fear was that with all the troops that the North Vietnamese were beginning to move down what we call the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos, that their buildup was more rapid than the buildup of the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese were being defeated on a piecemeal basis. They were losing forces more rapidly than they could be recruited and retrained. And I was very concerned that we would find ourselves at the point of no return. That did not happen, primarily because we did bring in reinforcements.
You wanted an offense.
I can't get animated
Take
unless
five.
you say,
General, in the spring of '65, Ambassador Taylor was interested in troop deployment in enclaves, and you favored an offensive strategy. What was wrong with the enclave?
well, the enclave was an essential interim step, and certainly until we could get some logistic bases organized and we could get our troops ashore, enclaves were an essential a step. But the idea of staying in enclaves where you would be on the defensive and where the enemy would have full reign of the countryside, to include the Highlands, we would just be setting up the enemy to cut us in two, cut the country in half, and the enemy would always have the initiative on our troops, who would be basically fixed in a defensive position. You don't win wars that way. I don't think there was any particular disagreement between General Taylor and myself. General Taylor was very, very loath to be a party to committing ground forces in the first instance, and so was I. But from a military standpoint, there was no choice. On the other hand, to be more specific as to some disagreement as to troop deployments, when the 1st Cavalry moved in, there was a feeling.
Got to change real.
Camera roll 617 coming up. 617. Take 6.
Do you want to come?
Yeah, when the 1st Cavalry moved in, they had great mobility, and there was a feeling in some quarters that I should deploy the 1st Cavalry along the coast. I did not want to do that. I wanted to move them inland, where they would be in a position to fight, yes, along the coast, but they would be in a position to fight in the Highlands along the Cambodian border because of the tremendous mobility that they had. So initially they went in about halfway between the Highlands and the coast at a place called An Khe, but they were not there very long. I moved them to the Highlands, where they had the first big fight with the North Vietnamese regular troops.
That was the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley.
That is correct. And following the siege of Plei Mi.
What did you win the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley?
Yeah, without any question. The enemy took a tremendous beating there, tremendous losses. Matter of fact, a statement was made that they had learned lessons that were so valuable that they accepted the losses as essential to learn lessons on how to fight American troops. It was the first time they had encountered American troops, and I think they were quite shocked by it, and they were badly hurt by it.
Was the 1st Air Cav a good outfit?
Yeah, excellent, superb.
How'd you feel about your boys at that point at the end?
Well, we at that time we had first-class fighting forces, first-class troops. I would say until the early '68, I don't think the American Army or the American military has ever put a better qualified, more professional force in the field than we had during that time frame.
When the troops first started coming in, the 173rd Airborne and the 101st Airborne and the Koreans and the 1st Infantry Division, did you know, back in the spring and the early summer, how did you feel about them? Were you pleased with the quality of the troops?
Well, I was. There were a few commanders that didn't measure up, but and we had to make some adjustments with respect to commanders. But I was very pleased with the troops. They had adjusted themselves well. They were well disciplined, and they were well led by officers and non-commissioned officers.
Is the 173rd Airborne a good outfit? Tell us.
Well, the 173rd was stationed at that time in Okinawa, and they only had 2 battalions, and they moved in, but subsequently were reinforced by a 3rd battalion. I deployed them initially along the coast in a place called Vung Tau, and then at Benoit.
Were they a good outfit?
They were excellent, and they fought in many parts of the country during the subsequent years.
How about the 101st?
101st, 1st Battalion moved in initially, and they were also a top-flight organization with superb officers and non-commissioned officers. The 1st Brigade of the 101st initially came into the Cam Ranh Bay area because I wanted to secure that area, and that put them in a central location where they could move in most any direction. Now, subsequently, the entire 101st Airborne Division arrived. They were programmed to arrive in '68, and I received intelligence on what subsequently resulted in the Tet Offensive, but intelligence that the enemy was building up. I asked that the deployment of the 101st be accelerated, and they came in December of '67.
But what about the Koreans? Were you pleased when they arrived?
I was, because I was in the Korean War. I knew the Korean soldier, and I knew a number of their officers. They came in first with the Capital Division, and then subsequently they were reinforced by 2nd Division. I employed them along the coast to protect the lines of communication north and south in the 2nd Corps region. They were well-disciplined soldiers. They, of course, did not have the mobility because of a lack of helicopters that my troops had. But we reinforced them with American helicopters from time to time.
In June of '65, you asked for B-52s for tactical support. Why did you do that?
I wanted to use firepower rather than manpower in taking the fight to the enemy. Men's lives on the battlefield are very, very precious, and every commander gives every consideration to getting his military job done at minimum cost. And in the main, the way to do that is to use firepower in a discriminating way. Extraordinary steps were taken to avoid civilian casualties. Unhappily, some did evolve, as in all wars. The enemy took cover in the jungles, and Vietnam has more than their share of jungle terrain. We were able to pick up intelligence as to the general location of enemy units, where they had their training camps and their so-called bivouac areas, staging areas. And when we could acquire that intelligence, you couldn't see it from overhead, but if you knew the general area, by using B-52s, we could strike an area target. And those B-52s were an innovation during the course of the Vietnam War, and it destroyed and disrupted a lot of the enemy actions. I call them spoiling attacks. You can have a spoiling attack with a B-52 raid, or you can have a spoiling attack by hitting an enemy unit by ground action while they're getting prepared for an offensive action themselves. Of course, one of the problems was if they moved across into Laos or Cambodia, they had a sanctuary, which gave the enemy considerable advantage, and which was the bane of my existence as a military man, to have those sanctuaries nearby. But the B-52 was an innovation, and extremely effective, greatly feared by the enemy. And those B-52 strikes were a great asset to every military commander, and much sought after.
They couldn't hear them, could they?
They couldn't hear them until they exploded, no.
At the end of '65, there was pretty massive American troop involvement. What effect did you think this was going to have on the morale of Arvin? Did you think that we were taking over the war and discouraging?
Well, there was always a danger that the deployment of American troops would be used as a crutch for Arvin. And we were very cognizant of that. I was very sensitive to it. And I talked to my counterpart, General Venn, who was a splendid officer, on many occasions about that. We did not want to put us in a position where we would do most of the fighting. On the other hand, the American troops were better prepared to fight in the hinterland. And the Vietnamese troops, I felt, were more adept at fighting among their own people near the populated areas. We were not able to draw a distinctive line in that regard, and I did not want to do that. But at the same time, we had a capability of fighting away from our bases that they did not possess in major degree, their airborne formations being an exception. Well, inevitably, however, as we deployed more American forces, there was an attitude that tended to pervade the Vietnamese ranks that we were taking over the war. We did everything we could to avoid that. And for that reason, I had long talks with Hugh and Venn, and subsequently I made the point to them that we were not going to be there forever, and the time would come when we would start progressively thinning our troops as they were capable of taking over the fight themselves. They welcomed that. They're proud people. They did not want us to take over command of their forces as the French did. And we did everything we could not to cast ourselves in the eyes of the Vietnamese in the role of their French masters. Which situation prevailed for about 100 years.
Okay, well, you're going to need a new battery. Thank you. Roger.
By the end of '65, you had succeeded in your objective of trying to prevent South Vietnam from being cut in half. Did the strategy change after that?
In the latter part of 1965, there was a very serious threat to cut the country in two by the North Vietnamese, and of course that was frustrated by our initiatives. In 1966, we had a logistic base that was on the verge of completion, and for the first time adequate to support operations in most parts of the country, not all parts of the country. And we had sufficient forces, really, to change our strategy from one of defense, but with sporadic offensive actions, to one of that would emphasize the offense. Of course, there were certain key areas, logistic areas, bases, and so forth, and communication centers that had to be secured. But we were in a position at that time with the troops and the mobility and the logistics in order to start taking the fight to the enemy in South Vietnam. Now, this was not a linear war like World War I and World War II or Korea. This was an area war, somewhat like the Civil War. We did not have enough troops to occupy all the country. We did not have enough troops to defend the demilitarized zone and the Cambodian-Lao borders. So when the enemy raised his head, well, our intelligence hopefully would be aware of his presence, and we could react by fire maneuver against him.
We're going to have to play another. General, you often said we could conquer territory but not hold it. How can you win a war like that?
Well, we had no choice, frankly. Our purpose was to defeat the enemy and pacify the country, and the country couldn't be pacified until the enemy was defeated. And when the enemy was detected, well, we went after him with firepower or with maneuver. I tried to do it with firepower, but firepower has its limitations. Of course, the whole matter was complicated by the Laos and Cambodia sanctuaries and North Vietnam, which is also a sanctuary for our ground forces. I felt that that was a temporary situation, and I prepared my plans and my troop lists and my logistics so that we could move into the sanctuaries at a later time. With a new administration moving into power, by a change in the strategy of the Johnson administration. The character of the war was not like World War II Korea or World War I, which were linear wars. This was an area war, something like the Civil War. If we had tried to fight a linear war, it would have taken, I would say, 3 or 4 full the troops that we had on the ground. It would instead of having, say, ultimately roughly 500,000 troops, it would probably taken 2 million troops to fight a linear war.
I have 2 more questions on the 65 period. When you first went in, did you think it was going to be a long haul, and did you tell the president it would be a long haul?
Well, my first private session with McNamara, and this was the spring of 1964, I told Mr. McNamara I thought it was going to be a long, drawn-out affair, that the task in front of us was formidable. It was going to take time, and I was afraid that it was going to try the patience of the American people. I then suggested that the administration might want to consider a people-to-people program to get the American people involved. I could see no other way of keeping them interested and involved, which I felt was necessary, particularly the strategy that had been enunciated at that time, that American people would get tired of a long, drawn-out war, and a people-to-people program could have gotten the American people emotionally involved, but apparently that, according to Mr. McNamara, had been ruled out.
What about in June or July of 65 when he was over in Saigon, just before the major troop buildup? Did you stress then that this was going to be a long haul?
Well, I can't say that I did. It was something that was on my mind, and he and I had many discussions. I did during that general time frame and later talk to him about the fact that I was interested in having only those forces deployed in Vietnam that we could sustain on an indefinite basis. And frankly, I had some communications with General Johnson, who was Chief Staff of the Army, trying to determine what could be sustained on an indefinite basis. But the matter, I don't want to oversimplify the matter, because the bombing campaign was a very important item in this regard, because the strategy of the administration was to hurt the enemy until he was encouraged to come to the bargaining table. And the strategy was to use our bombing and our efforts in the South to try to convince the leaders in Hanoi that they could not win, and get them to the bargaining table, and then bargain from a position of strength and come to some agreement at the conference table. And that was the strategy. But that meant that we had to make that strategy credible by convincing the enemy by our actions that we had the capability of hurting him more than we were, and we were prepared to do that. And that is what brought about the escalation in the ground forces, and that is what brought about the escalation in the bombing campaign. The bombing campaign, however, was not effective because it was off and on, depending upon public reactions at home. And as you well recall, during the 66, 67, 68 time frame, every time a bombing campaign was started, there would be marches on the Pentagon and demonstrations, and the politicians were inclined to back off. Also, during that time frame, there were ceasefires called for Tet and New Year's and Christmas, etc., all of which I objected to. On one occasion, President Johnson went to see the Pope. The Pope made a special request for a ceasefire, which the President honored. And this weakened this perception that we were trying to impose on the enemy, that we had the power to hurt him, and to hurt him progressively more if he did not come to his senses and come to the conference table.
Let's move ahead a little bit to the end of 1967. You gave an optimistic speech at the press club in Washington. Did you feel comfortable making it? Were you under any pressure from?
No, I was under no pressure at all. I wanted.
Could you start that again?
I was no. Oh, well, apropos of a speech that I made in November '67 to the National Press Club. I wrote the speech. It was upon my initiative. I was not asked to make a speech of any particular type. I wanted to make it known that it was not our plan to stay in Vietnam indefinitely. We wanted to pass the war to the Vietnamese as fast as practical. I wanted the Vietnamese to get that message also. When I returned to Saigon, President Thieu thanked me. He said, we are complimented by this, and we now have a more precise objective to move toward. Now, I made no particular prediction when we would be able to turn the war over to them. I felt that perhaps in a period of 2 years or less, the enemy could be hurt to the point and weakened to the point, and the Vietnamese could be built up to the point where a token amount of troops might be withdrawn. But the withdrawal of troops would be contingent upon the ability of the Vietnamese to take over the role from us, and to the extent that the enemy had been weakened.
As far as let's get on to Tet. Did you have any intelligence indicating that there might be an offensive at the time of Tet?
We started picking up information the latter part of 1967 that the enemy was building up for some initiatives that we thought might be major in nature. And there was certain fighting along the Cambodian and Laos borders that suggested that there were tremendous reinforcements moving to the south. That was corroborated by other intelligence. I therefore asked that the 101st Airborne Division, that already had one brigade deployed in Vietnam, but I asked for the rest of the division to be deployed in the latter part of '67. They had been programmed to come in '68. So their deployment was moved up at my request based on this intelligence. Of course, in January of 1968, we picked up considerable intelligence on build-up. We had defectors that came in and gave us information, and it became very clear that the enemy was preparing for a rather major offensive.
Did you take any precautions?
Oh, many. I had any number of operations that I had planned, and I canceled those operations in view of this intelligence. I moved the 101st Airborne Division that I said before came in the latter part of 1967 into the 3rd Corps area, the populated area. I had some operations planned along the Cambodian border, which I canceled, and repositioned the troops along the approaches to Saigon. As Tet approached, it became very evident that although the enemy had said that they were going to have a ceasefire for 7 days, and we were under great pressure from Washington politically to have a ceasefire ourselves, and of course the Vietnamese had traditionally had a ceasefire because of Tet and the celebrations that go on there. I was able to get that squeezed down with the cooperation of the ambassador, and accepted by President Thieu to 36 hours. As it became very clear that there was going to be a major offensive action either on Tet or before, immediately before or after, all of my troops were put on 100% alert. All passes were canceled. I was able to get General Ven, who was my counterpart, who was head of the Vietnamese forces, to keep 50% of his people there and keep them on full alert. He felt for purposes of morale that he had to let some go for Tet, a magnitude of 50%. Certain redisposition of forces were made at the last minute based on intelligence that we acquired. And in addition to that, as intelligence built up and we were able to better refine our estimates on the timing of the attack, I got Chu to agree to canceling all leaves and putting all forces and stopping all men that were leaving our units for Tet in the First Corps area.
We got a change.
Take 9.
With respect to the northern part of the country, the First Corps area, we were able to get the Vietnamese to stop all leaves and have 100% of their force on alert. This was before the offensive took place. And meanwhile, there was a high degree of alert at Khe Sanh. Several weeks before that, we had received intelligence from a defector that there was going to be a major attack on Khe Sanh. I moved in some reconnaissance units, had the Marines reinforce the area. We then set up an air plan to make airstrikes using tactical bombers and B-52s in the vicinity of Khe Sanh, where there was relatively no population. In addition to that, sensors were shifted from the Ho Chi Minh Trail that we called in Laos to the environs of Khe Sanh, which could pick up any movement. These efforts proved to be extremely effective. I never thought that Khe Sanh was going to be another Binh Dinh Phu. I did feel that it was a target that the enemy was very much interested in, that he would want to seize it. And I wanted to fight him in the hinterland rather than allow him to get down among the people, which would have been very costly in casualties by my forces and the Vietnamese forces. And also there would have been many civilian casualties and civilian property destroyed if we had allowed those two divisions to move down into the lowlands.
You never thought the garrison there would be overrun?
Not in the least. Not in the least. I felt very secure about it. And we were all very well prepared to land supplies initially on the airstrip there, which we'd upgraded in order to allow 130s to land. And then when the enemy brought in artillery, we were able to supply that particular garrison, which consisted of 4 Marine battalions and 1 Vietnamese Ranger battalion and a few special forces. We were able to reinforce them by airdrop of logistics, not by the landing of aircraft. But I felt very secure about this, but Washington became very nervous about it. And I tried to calm them down, that I had perfect confidence that we could hold Khe Sanh and the enemy was going to be severely hurt. But it was given so much visibility by the media, the president became very nervous.
Was the president worried it might be another Dien Bien Phu?
There are indications of that, yes. He had a special war room set up run by General Taylor, and he was trying to follow in the White House the developments step by step and in great detail.
Now, the embassy, the attack on the embassy got a lot of visibility and so on, but in the American media. But how did you evaluate this in terms of the overall military picture at the time?
Well, I think it was relatively insignificant.
Can you start and say the attack on the embassy?
The attack on the embassy was a very dramatic development and given a lot of visibility by the media, a lot of gloom and doom statements. The attack was launched by a handful of sappers. All they had on was shorts. They blasted a hole in the wall surrounding the embassy yard and they crawled through this particular hole in the wall, and by mid-morning they were all killed. I personally went through the embassy from top to bottom, and nobody got in the embassy. There was a pane glass window that was broken in the process of the fight that went on, which was conducted by the Marine Guards and by a MP company that we had designated to reinforce anywhere in Saigon if required. But basically, the security of the embassy was the responsibility of the Vietnamese. This was politically a very dramatic incident. It was terribly overplayed. Militarily, it had very little significance, but politically, it did have great significance because it gave the impression that we were not able to defend even our own embassy. And of course, any embassy in any capital of the world could be attacked by stealth operations of that type in any big city.
Well, what do you think the communists were trying to accomplish in the Tet Offensive? What do you think their objectives were?
Well, I felt at the time, and I think subsequent information has confirmed, that they honestly thought that if they put on a big offensive and North Vietnamese troops were moved to the south and they gained the initiative by a surprise attack, that the people of South Vietnam were going to rise up against the Q regime. The people of South Vietnam would rise up against the Saigon regime. And that didn't happen. There wasn't one single case of a public uprising. And this was quite a blow and quite a surprise to the authorities in Hanoi. Of course, as it turned out, a great visibility was given to this. The media displayed great gloom and doom for the first several days and gave the impression that we were being defeated. Yes, there were some setbacks, but they were very temporary. The force was defeated, and the Viet Cong were virtually depleted, and the Hanoi troops were very badly hurt to the point it took them about 2 years to recover. This point was obscured by the initial reaction of the American public, that it was the Americans and the South Vietnamese that were being defeated.
So, militarily, how would you evaluate it from Hanoi's point of view?
Well, during the period of 1967, we made tremendous progress. We had the troops to do it, and we were constantly on the move, opening roads and expanding the area under government control. The enemy didn't win a single battle or skirmish of any consequence. Hanoi decided that they had to do something spectacular to change its losing battlefield fortunes, which is typical of any battle. In effect, we saw the Germans do this in World War II when von Rundstedt made the attack into the Ardennes. And the Allied troops were tremendously set back, but the Germans were defeated, and it was downhill the rest of the way. It was the same psychology which is typical in any war, where in '67 the Vietnamese were losing and they launched an attack. They hoped a surprise attack, which it wasn't. Although we didn't know everywhere he was going to attack, we knew that the attack was coming and we knew the general time frame of it. He attacked on a much broader front than I had anticipated. There were some setbacks, but they're very temporary. But he hoped by this initiative that he could gain the initiative himself and that his losing fortunes would be changed. But the unhappy thing was that by virtue of the impression that the American public received from the gloom and doom of the early days of the Tet Offensive, the enemy was begged to come to the conference table, and there they sat for 4 years and decided only one thing, the shape of the conference table. They finally came to an agreement. It was very one-sided. They did not live up to their agreement. Neither side totally did, to include the South Vietnamese in some respects, and the agreement totally collapsed. And so did South Vietnam after we had withdrawn our troops.
It's widely regarded that you asked for 206,000 additional troops in '68. Was that the case?
No, this has been tremendously distorted. At the time of the Tet Offensive, I asked for only those troops that were on the way to me anyway, that had been promised and had been organized, and I asked that they be accelerated. Mr. Johnson then sent a message, if you need further reinforcements, please call for them. I took no steps in that regard till General Wheeler came over. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Wheeler told me that there was a good prospect that the reserves would be mobilized, that the strategy would be changed. And if reserves are mobilized and our strategy was changed to be an offensive strategy that would break down some of the geographical barriers of Laos and Cambodia and allow us to take the war to the enemy in a more effective way through the bombing campaign, what would I want to bring the war to an end? It was in the context then of a contingency plan based on an assumption of a decision, and it was not a request per se. It was decided that we would eventually withdraw, and we would not escalate further. And that request was denied, but I did say, in order to facilitate my gaining the initiative on the energy, on the Hanoi regime, the enemy troops, to facilitate my regaining that initiative, I asked that I be given moderate reinforcements.
Okay. Yeah. General, how did you feel about Secretary Clifford's refusal to grant all the troops that you wanted, or putting a ceiling on the amount of troop buildup in '68?
Well, let me put this in perspective. General Wheeler came over to see me. We talked about a war-winning strategy, mobilizing reserves, and assuming a more aggressive policy to try to take the war to the enemy and force them to the conference table, where we'd be in a position to negotiate from a position of strength. And the so-called 206,000 was on the assumption that a new strategy would be adopted that would be a war-winning strategy. Mr. Johnson, after General Wheeler returned from Saigon, turned the matter over to Mr. Clifford, who was the new Secretary of Defense. And he studied the matter. He never talked to me. Mr. McNamara, every time I made a troop request, Mr. McNamara and I discussed it, but I was never asked to come to Washington, and nobody came to Saigon, Mr. Clifford, or his representative, to discuss it with me following the visit by General Wheeler. And it was decided that we would not pursue a war-winning strategy. And I, of course, accepted that as a political decision from the administration. However, since it was decided that we would not pursue a war-winning strategy, and the 206,000 was in the context of such a new strategy, which General Wheeler told me was to be considered, I did ask for relatively modest reinforcements to facilitate my gaining more rapidly the initiative on the enemy. And that in essence, was a result of the Clifford study.
How do you feel in general about not pursuing a war-winning strategy? I mean, you're trained to fight, and here you had your hand behind your back. How do you feel about it? Not necessarily in '68, but...
Well, it was a frustrating experience, I think, by all military men, because they are trained to win wars. And when they're frustrated in that attempt, it's a frustrating matter. However, the Vietnam conflict was a most unusual one. We had, for the first time, I guess, in our history, in any substantial degree, a group of dissenters, or a significant portion of our population, who were violently opposed to the war and who were waving the flag of the enemy, which was a very disconcerting thing to all of us in Vietnam, that there were young men and women and professors on campuses that were actually cheering the enemy on and waving the flag of the enemy. The country became tremendously divided, and in the final analysis, this is why Mr. Johnson backed off from pursuing a war-winning policy. The military, of course, is subject to the control of the commander-in-chief, and we accepted it. However, it was my hope and my feeling that with a new administration coming into power, there'd be some reconsideration of this. So I hadn't given up all hope.
How did you feel when you became Chief of Staff, when you were relieved of the command?
Well, I was over in Vietnam 4.5 years. I was told in 1967, when I visited Washington in the fall by General Wheeler, that after 4 years I would be given another assignment. That the decision would be made after they had decided what would happen to General Johnson, the Chief of Staff of the Army, after he had finished his 4-year tour.
We have lost the ball.
General
Take a
Wheeler
look at.
Colonel, why don't you just complete that?
Yes. General Johnson was the Chief of Staff of the Army at the time. General Wheeler told me in '67 that a decision would be made on what would happen to General Johnson after he finished his 4-year tour as Chief of Staff of the Army, at which time I would be given another assignment, which would mean that I would have been in Vietnam for 4.5 years. Now, in anticipation of my being given another assignment based on what was planned in 1967, General Abrams was sent over to be my deputy, which he was for well over a year. So he was well prepared to move into the command slot, and when General Johnson finished his 4-year tour, which was inevitable by law, and it was decided that he would retire, President Johnson appointed me to replace General Johnson as Chief of Staff of the Army. But this was planned back in '67, but the decision as to what would happen to General Johnson was the only missing link. General Wheeler asked me what assignment I wanted, and I was non-committal.
What was your assessment of the enemy? What kind of people were you fighting? Did you have respect for them?
Very well disciplined, highly motivated. They spent more time on political indoctrination than they did on military training. Of course, it was a highly autocratic regime, and as they moved down south the Ho Chi Minh Trail, well, if they didn't behave, there was somebody behind them to shoot them in the back. But there were some desertions. The manpower problem became rather acute, and this acuteness was evidenced during the Tet Offensive, where we would pick up soldiers 16, 17 years old. But they were highly disciplined, highly motivated soldiers.
Just one follow-up question on the Tet Offensive. Essentially, you won the Tet Offensive, didn't you? I mean,
Statistics would suggest that, and I believe
the NLF was it an effective force after that?
they were virtually decimated. They were not totally wiped out, but they were crippled to the point that they were a nuisance thereafter, and not a big nuisance at that.
We had a vast American build-up and a tremendous power, and here are these guys that you're fighting with, rode down the trail on bicycles in the beginning anyway. Why didn't this power make a difference?
Well, it could have made a difference if we had stuck with a plan and we had had a war-winning strategy. The North Vietnamese troops were far better equipped than you suggest. They weren't a bunch of guerrillas. They had Russian weapons and rather good ones. They were well trained, as I said before, highly motivated. They had infiltrated a considerable part of the country where they had political cadres and guerrilla units. The political cadres were not wiped out during the Tet Offensive, but a lot of the guerrillas, as I said before, were. But we had to open roads, we had to build logistics, we had to get prepared not only to fight the guerrillas, but to fight the North Vietnamese forces, which virtually came down in strength, of course, at the time of the Tet Offensive, and had infiltrated down starting in 1964. Also, as we prepared our troop build-up, we had to be prepared to cope with the Chinese that they came in. And Mr. Johnson was somewhat paranoid about, and some of the people in the State Department, that the Chinese might eventually come into the fray. And, of course, as a military commander, I had to be cognizant of that. I frankly didn't think they would come in, but at the same time, a commander in the field has to be prepared to deal with the worst case. Why didn't we succeed? Very simply, the country became divided to the point where they did not choose, politicians did not choose to pursue the war long enough in order to bring the enemy to the conference table and to negotiate from a position of strength. A war-winning strategy was not adopted. A strategy of withdrawal was adopted. They did get the enemy to the conference table in Paris, but we negotiated from a position of weakness, particularly political weakness, as Hanoi observed the domestic scene, where the country was divided and young men were cheering on and waving the enemy flag. And I think a lesson to be learned is that young men should not be sent to the battlefield unless the country is going to support them.
Can you describe for us some of the complex logistical problems you faced in 1965?
Vietnam was roughly halfway around the world, very remote to the United States, even remote to Hawaii. Vietnam was really an undeveloped country. They had one deep water port. There were 3 jet-capable airfields. We did not have a logistic organization. My request started back after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in '64 for the foundation of a logistic organization and for an engineer brigade were turned down. And when troops were deployed, we had virtually no logistics. They had to be built up, and they were built up in an amazingly short time. And what am I talking about? Airfields, ports, supply depots, maintenance facilities, communication networks, and matters of this type. This is that part of the military iceberg that is below the water that very few people are acquainted with. And I think quite a spectacular job was done in preparing those logistics to the point where we could fight in any part of the country, and we could have gone into Laos, we could have gone into Cambodia, we could have moved north of the demilitarized zone if national policy had permitted it.
But I want this just the tape's going still. Give us an indication of the kinds of things that are below the tip of the iceberg. I mean, you worry about sewage systems and repairing.
Well, I wouldn't say sewage systems. Sewage is a very simple thing to handle on the battlefield. You just dig a hole. But we are talking about certain base areas. We're talking about commissaries. We're in Vietnam. We had a very unique problem that Vietnam would have been plagued with runaway inflation if we had not had some post exchanges there for the troops to spend their dollars. If we had not had an offshore recreation program to allow troops during one time of their tour go to Hong Kong or Bangkok to Manila or later on even to Australia to spend their dollars offshore. If they'd spent their dollars in the local market, the entrepreneurs, the Chinese and Vietnamese, would have profited from it, whereas when they spent it in the post exchange, the soldiers themselves profited because this was run as a fund for the benefit of the military. But it took the pressure off the local economy, and without that, the inflationary pressures would have been intolerable, and this would have had very much of an adverse political effect. So all of these factors go into the development of a military force. But you also have to anticipate forces that might be needed in emergencies, such as during the siege of Khe Sanh. I felt secure because we had a heavy drop capability where we could drop supplies by parachute, and we did that. And we knew it would work because we'd had much experience in doing that.
Just want to take one more minute. Give me a sense of I was thinking of using you as a voiceover from the film of the first troops that came in. That's what I was asking you about
Yes.
the 173rd. Little indication of what their battle record was or how good they were. I wanted to build up a sense of sort of pride in these outfits.
Yes.
And your pride in it. But the 173rd, the 101st Airborne.
The 3rd Marine Division?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, the troops that were deployed in Vietnam during the build-up were well-established military units with magnificent records during the Korean War, doing World War II, and in some cases doing World War I. They were manned by top-grade officers and non-commissioned officers. They had excellent equipment. They were elite, very competent and very effective troops that America could be proud of. And this situation prevailed, frankly, until, I would say, 69, 70, where the Army ran out of non-coms. They had to lower the standards for officers because a lot of the officer material was on the campuses where they did not have to serve. They were given an exemption by going onto the campuses of the country.
Who were the Screaming Eagles?
The 101st Airborne Division that distinguished themselves during World War II. The 82nd Airborne had a brigade there. They have a magnificent record. The 1st Infantry Division has had a record in every war since World War I. Distinguished record during the course of World War I, World War II. The 3rd Marine Division, magnificent record during the war in the Pacific during World War II. The 1st Marine Division, a magnificent record. These were...
Who was the Big Red One?
The Big Red One is the 1st Division. But the 9th Division, likewise, wonderful record in World War II, because, and I know this personally because that was my division in World War II. But the 4th Division was 1st Cavalry Division. All of these divisions had splendid records in other conflicts. And when they were initially introduced, they were in first-class shape with excellent leadership and excellent equipment and tremendous morale, high degree of discipline. But as the war drug on and on, the leadership had to be watered down by virtue, particularly the non-coms and the junior officers, by virtue of the educational deferment policy, by virtue of the attrition on the non-commissioned officers, by virtue of the fact that a considerable percentage of the Army and the Marine Corps were overseas and not training at home. And all these factors put tremendous stresses and strains on the military, particularly the Army, over a long period of time, the longest war in history. Korea lasted 3 years. Vietnam required substantial sacrifice by any number of military people over a period of 7 years. The strain on the families by family separation. And of course, a major factor was those that were killed and wounded. The ranks were treated on the battlefield.
I think we better...
Can I just get quiet for a second?
Did you say something to me?
No,
No.